Ladies and gentlemen, I warmly welcome you all to this panel on the theme Religion, Madness and Mimetic Theory. What we'll perform for you today is a reprise of the same panel at the annual conference of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion last June at the Institut Catholique de Paris in Paris, France. Unfortunately, the panel in Paris wasn't video recorded. Because of the impact of the theme, however, the president of COV&R, as Colloquium is usually called, COV&R, Professor Martha Reinecke and editor Maura Junius, have asked us to resume the panel and yet make a video recording at a suitable place in the Netherlands. We say many thanks to the Balie for offering their studios, people and equipment to this purpose. My name is Joachim Duyndam, and I will serve today as your moderator, as I did in Paris. I will first briefly explain the theme of this panel and then introduce to you the two presenters. To introduce, well, many sorts of connections are to be drawn between religion and madness. For quite some people, religion offers protection against folly and madness. For some of them, religion can even bring deliverance from madness. But the border can also be very narrow when religion itself is seen and experienced as a form of madness. René Girard considers religion, particularly religion as it took shape in the Judeo-Christian tradition, as a remedy to the violent aspects of society, which are, in his view, caused by mimetic desire and the scapegoat mechanism. In this ordinary panel, various relationships between religion, madness and mimetic theory are explored, starting from the life experiences of the two main presenters, Elias and Berry Vorstenbosch. Both are so-called experienced experts in the field, having faced psychoses themselves. For Michael, mimetic theory offered an opening to religion. For Berry, religion offered an opening to mimetic theory. Both were able to overcome their psychoses with the help of the insights from mimetic theory. To introduce the presenters, Michael Elias is a linguist who taught at the Free University of Amsterdam and directed for 30 years Lexis Language Agency. His books bear upon the urban dialect of The Hague, language change, taboos in contemporary speech, riddle stories, and mimetic theory. He learned Hebrew, served on the board of a dialect village in Israel, and published on the conflict between Jews and Palestinians. For 18 years, he was the convener and president of the Dutch Girard Society. After his retirement in 2020, he debuted as a novelist with Alectorius in Dutch Hanesteen, based on his experiences in a psychiatric institution. 2 years ago, Berry Vorstenbosch published De Overtocht, which in English would be translated as The Crossing. The subtitle of the book is Philosophical View on a Psychosis. In this book, Berry tries to understand what has happened to him in his adolescence, employing the help of philosophers such as Martin Heidegger, Jacques Derrida, and above all, René Girard. The first hallucinatory period resulted in hospitalization. A second period, 5 years later, finally resulted into a conversion to Christianity. For explaining some of the workings of what is called psychosis by psychiatrists, or madness in more popular terms, Berry will in his talk focus on two Girardian concepts: metaphysical desire and the crisis of difference. The two lectures will be presented intertwined. We'll start with the first part of Michael's paper, followed by the first part of Berry's. Next, Michael will take his second part, and Berry will do the same with his. The panel will be concluded by myself, providing a narrative philosophical view on the topic, and so trying to shed a light from a general human point of view. Michael, you have the floor.
Yeah, the title of my presentation is A Patchwork of Non-Integrated Others. It has been a long time since I first presented a paper at a COV&R conference in 1994 in Wiesbaden, entitled Neck Riddles in Mimetic Theory, later published in Contagion. It discusses riddle stories in which a man sentenced to death saves his life by propounding the judge a riddle which he cannot possibly guess or find by wit, because it is based on bizarre experiences, unique to the condemned person. Somewhat similar to what I did in my lecture, because I hid the fact that my research, which I would later get my doctorate on, was inspired by the eccentric experiences from psychoses that overtook me between 1979 and 1983 and landed me in a psychiatric hospital. Moreover, the motive of a condemned person saving his life is related to the experiences of my father, who spent weeks in a death cell at Buchenwald concentration camp during World War II and miraculously escaped death. As the eldest in the family, I was definitely the boy who had to make everything right. I'm convinced that a lot of research is related to a researcher's own experiences. Our maître à penser, René Girard, tells in his book Quand ces choses commenceront, published just before that Wiesbaden conference, to Michel Tréguer, when he reflects on the last chapter of Mensonges romantiques. You're right, of course, about there being a personal experience behind what I say. I ended up understanding that I was going through an experience of the kind that I was describing. In his overview of Girard's work, Wolfgang Palaver wrote, he began to turn away from his own pride and to see himself as a puppet of his own mimetic desire. Girard as a caveat in 1994. There is the danger of narcissism. I also experience that today when I do not stick to the theory but try to clarify parts of my life story from the moment I started René Girard's Des choses cachées depuis la fondation du monde, which offered me a new opening to my Christian background. It stimulated me to start learning Hebrew, to investigate its roots. Now, my learning still continues in a study group compared to what Jews do in a Beit HaMidrash. The Torah is too great to be owned by any of us. So the mimetic rivalry that is always there becomes a fruitful mimesis. Lernen leads to freedom. Now, the last 10 years we've been studying the book of Exodus, Shemot, with midrashim from the long rabbinic tradition. It's a book of liberation that finally gave me the courage to write about that profound period in the psychiatric hospital. From the third part of Des choses cachées, I learned a lot about interindividuality, and also from Jean-Michel Vaucourlian's mimetic brain, in which he distinguishes between the rational, emotional, and mimetic brain, and from Henri Grivois, who published on incipient psychoses. Now, initially, I steered towards a kind of psychophilosophical self-analysis using insights from mimetic theory. However, in the end, I decided it will not be a scientific treatise, but a novel, for several reasons. First, I learned from Mensonge Romantique that real knowledge can be conveyed very well through a novel. Second, Hungarian writer and Nobel Prize winner Imre Kertész, explaining why he was unable to describe his real-life concentration camp experiences, gave me the freedom to paradoxically tell the truth, the real story in fiction. Third, I could by no means remember exactly what has happened, and therefore had to resort to fiction, even though I had preserved material from these years. 4. People in my immediate surroundings I wanted to make unrecognizable by literary means. The American writer David Venn once said, according to a Dutch writer, "You must sacrifice your family on the altar of fiction." I didn't want that, especially not regarding my mother. And finally, I was inspired by a Jewish sage from the 18th century in Lithuania, the Maggid of Dubno. He explains why the truth of Torah is not presented as a philosophy or code of law, but in stories and parables. Truth was walking about town, but everyone was scared to look at him. Wherever he went, people screamed and ran away because he was completely naked. Along came his friend named Story, who told Truth that if he wanted to be accepted, he would offer him a suit of clothing. That is what happened. Story gave Truth a suit, so people would be more comfortable in his presence. My novel, Hanesteen, was not published in Dutch until 40 years after my hospitalization. In 2020, after my working life. Is that a long time? Recently, in Jerusalem, I met a woman who works in trauma counseling, and she said 40 years is normal before people gain sight of what happened to them. Hanesteen, in English literally cock's stone. The Latin equivalent is, like Joachim said, Alectorius, the name of my alter ego, with which I dare to dive into my psychoses again, to describe the 4 years in the institution, to look back on what preceded and to interpret the reconversion that ensued. That conversion, by origin I am Roman Catholic, but by 1970 I had become an avowed atheist for 10 years. Well, that conversion was able to take place partly because of Girard's insight into what the holy actually means. But also I started to realize how important faith had been to my father in the concentration camp, where secret Eucharistic celebrations took place with a priest consecrating crumbs of bread. It helped him survive. In the death cell where he awaited execution, he had prayed passionately. Martin Luther said, "The word God is something that comes to mind when you are no longer making it. The real God is that of the victims." Now, since the publication of my book, I've been lecturing about it regularly, but I always have to overcome diffidence when my underlying experiences are discussed. It's easier to talk about physical illnesses. With psychoses, you quickly see frowned eyebrows, subtle scapegoating. In that sense, my novel was also a coming out. Now, back to Des choses cachées depuis la fondation du monde. I discovered it in September 1981 at a French bookstore in Amsterdam. On a Saturday, I was allowed to return to my apartment in the city for a weekend from the psychiatric hospital near the coast. Immediately, I was struck by Gourlian's question on the first page about the problem of desire, to Girard's thesis that only the religious will yield the secret of man. A revelation which resonated with experiences during my first psychosis in 1979 that arose when I worked as a sociolinguist at the Free University and read Louis Althusser about ideological state apparatuses. This hardened communist brought up a Bible passage in which Moses figured, could that be? As an intellectual in the 20th century, religion was passé, wasn't it? Had not Catholicism shackled me in a calcified morality? And had I not been liberated by, for instance, in sexualibus, ignoring all prohibitions? I had been an altar boy in church, but the Bible? In addition, in the Netherlands, religion was then and now hardly taken seriously by intellectuals. But I looked up the passage in Exodus in which Moses stands before the burning bush. It made me giddy, as if I were reading along with Moses those ideological state apparatuses instead of the other way around. It was this reversal that impressed me 2 years later in Des choses cachées. The religious will yield the secret of man. At the asylum, I retreated to the dormitory between therapies to read Des choses cachées with red ears, flying back and forth between passages on mimesis and rivalry about the scapegoat mechanism, its concealment in myth and rites, the Judeo-Christian scriptures and the structure of psychoses. It seemed like this book was written especially for me. I immediately applied the passages about victimhood and holy kingship to my therapy group, and what my father was telling me, that I shouldn't think I could hold an audience in the madhouse like a royal. It is well known from mimetic theory that psychotics lose their self and identify with others, that there is a desire to be like another. Who had been my models?
Desire, metaphysical desire, that's a very well-known Girardian term, and that's what the first section of my talk will be about. One of the first questions Jean-Michel Gourlian poses as a psychiatrist, hearing the stories of his clients, is, where are the models? Cherchez le modèle. In the case of my psychosis, to answer this question is not really difficult. Being an undergraduate student in physics, my absolute hero was Albert Einstein. And so he was to many other students of physics. You could find his picture, particularly the one with the tongue protruded, hanging on the walls in many student rooms. Apart from Einstein himself, I need to mention another person who played an important role in my psychosis, someone in my own social environment. He was a student of physics too, working on a thesis in which he was trying to reconcile relativity and quantum physics. He was the brother-in-law of one of my friends, 4 or 5 years older than me. In my book, I call him Cecil. Stories about his audacious intellectual enterprise were circulating. Recently, he had read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Pirsig, a book which had greatly inspired him. At high school, I was a very talented student, particularly in math and physics. One of the questions that started to play up in my psychosis was already haunting my mind at high school. Here I quote from my book, "With his fourth dimension and the idea that mass can be converted into energy, Einstein was the father of modern atomic physics and contributed to the building of scientific knowledge indispensable for the manufacturing of nuclear weapons. What would he have done if he had known this beforehand?" This question had been bothering me for a long time. It was in the late 70s. The great peace demonstrations of 1981 and 1983 in Holland were coming. At the time, we often talked about the bomb and doomsday. Knowing how Einstein had fared, I wondered what I would do if, as a physicist, I would discover the fifth dimension. Would I make it known to the world? In the early phase of my psychosis, I had a delusion about becoming part of a group of initiates, about becoming part of a secret society. I thought I participated in a group of geniuses who were hiding an apocalyptic secret. It started with a train of thought about René Descartes and his cogito, and suddenly I realized also Einstein was part of the club. Another passage I quote from, "But suddenly it seemed as if the scales were falling from my eyes. Of course, Einstein already had discovered the fifth dimension himself, but he didn't say so. How could I have missed that? Einstein also is an initiate." Here, the borderline between fantasy and reality became very thin indeed. In the weeks that followed, as my mental excitement was still interrupted by a series of normal days, I could sometimes wake up in the middle of the night thinking, how many people are actually initiates? And who are they? Leonardo da Vinci? William Shakespeare? The initiates knew that if the truth of the world would be revealed, the world would come to an end. The truth of the world was that it possessed 5 dimensions. In my psychotic mind, the 5th dimension acquired a name, and the name was man. I developed some very strange theories, becoming a kind of reconciliation hero. My theory was not only reconciliating relativity and quantum physics, but anthropology and psychology as well. Yes, like many psychotics do, I developed a great theory of everything. On New Year's Eve of 1979, I met Cecil at a party. I assumed he was an initiate too. Now I was able to find out. I sat down next to him. This is also in my book, this is a quote. I sat down next to him and quickly turned the conversation to his senior thesis and the number of dimensions the world possesses. I suggested writing down our ideas on a piece of paper and then exchanging them. On my note, I wrote 1 space, 2 space, 3 space, 4 time, 5 man. We exchanged notes, and I opened Cecil's note. With growing amazement, I read 1 space, 2 space, 3 space, 4 time, 5 imaginary, 6 imaginary. My brain was running at full speed. If you multiply 2 imaginary dimensions, you get 1 real dimension. Yes, man, a real living human being. Because I times I equals -1. I applied the logic of complex numbers, in which I is the square root of -1. There you can see it. I is the number, the symbol for imaginary, and it's equal to the square root of -1. So if you take 2 dimensions with I times I is -1. Or if you square I, it is -1. This is not my psychotic invention. This is real mathematics, to be sure. Cecil had arrived at the same result, but in a different way. My first feeling was one of immense relief. Do I have to explain that metaphysical desire is at play here? The desire for the being of a model? The desire to be Albert Einstein? Both Cecil and I were enthralled by becoming a great physicist. We shared a model, and he, being more informed about physics than I was, had advanced knowledge. Of course, after exchanging our notes, I assumed Cecil knew also about the end of the world. When I got home the next day, I panicked and I called Cecil. He came to me and took me in his car to the house where he lived with his wife in a small town some 30 miles away. There I lived for 3 days. I wanted him to explain his theory, and to some extent he did. Now here, Girard's theory starts to lose its explaining power. Maybe there was competition and rivalry between Cecil and me, but we didn't have any conflict. Cecil, such was the experience in my psychosis, helped me out of a horrifying loneliness. After 3 days, he brought me back home, but understanding that something was wrong with me, he was afraid to leave me alone. He called in one of my friends, and together they took me first to a doctor and then to the local hospital. I was easily convinced there were hardly serious arguments, let alone violence.
Thank you, Berry, for your exploration on the metaphysical desire. Halfway through my studies in somewhat dull Leiden, and after a failed relationship, I yearned for the freedom of worldly Amsterdam in the 1970s, where a sister and friends of mine led a libertine life. I wanted to imitate them. I later understood from Girard. Idols they became. In my novel, I wrote that Alectorius was a patchwork of non-integrated others. After my discharge from the hospital, I read in Girard, Le Bouc Émissaire, about the demons of Gerasa in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, and was able to draw a parallel with the legion that dwelt within me. To a large extent, my recovery then consisted of relating my bizarre experiences to the mystical texts of the prophets and the curious interpretations of rabbis who, like psychotics, hear many words differently. For example, Exodus 32:16 says, "The tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, inscribed on the tablets." Do not read inscribed, charut, they say, but chirut, freedom. For only he will turn out to be a free man who engages in the study of Torah. As I said, my incipient psychosis started in September 1979, in the night before I had to give a socio-linguistic lecture at the Free University. The tension in my life, both private and professional, had been running high. And suddenly, it seemed superfluous to me to prepare that lecture, for I had meanwhile become the archangel after who I am named, Michael, Michael. I could lecture offhand. And elated, I wandered around the city, did not sleep, and returned by morning to put on white clothes and shoes. When I arrived at the university, colleagues looked at me with strange eyes, but I could still talk normally. In the lecture hall, I spoke like an angel, stood on a bench, and began to violently gesticulate against the prevailing university culture in which students didn't learn anything that really mattered. They loved it at first, laughing. But when I started cursing and ranting, some left the lecture hall. In the evening, a friend came to visit who understood my condition, and with her husband, she took me to a crisis center. That's how it started. After a few months in a clinic in Amsterdam, I opted for a therapeutic community in the psychiatric hospital near the dunes, a Protestant institution where in the main building there was a stone plaque that read, "Jesus healed all who were sick to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah. He took our illnesses from us and carried away our diseases." Matthew 8. Although at first I was at loss for all religion in my delusions, I had asked the pastor of the hospital, "Can we have a group here where we study Bible texts?" Well, that worked. But when he started the first meeting with a prayer, I was annoyed. Prayer? I just wanted to study if the Bible was for me. And then I discovered Girard's work in 1981, which accelerated my reawakened interest in religion. Although even after that, I had to spend several episodes of psychosis in an isolation cell where I panicked and started praying again. Over the years, I learned to inscribe my psychotic experiences into the larger story of the Jewish and Christian traditions. I recognized the rivalries within the families in Genesis, identified with Moses in his vision by the burning bush, experienced the liberation of the Israelites from the house of slavery. The visions of Isaiah and Ezekiel became less strange, just as Jesus when he is tempted by the devil on the pinnacle of the temple, Luke 4, or when he says to Nicodemus, John 3, "You must be born again." As a psychotic, I had died, lay among the corpses in a concentration camp, and caught something of Ezekiel 37, where the Lord says, "Dry bones, I'm going to put breath into you, and you will live." Now, Girard's interpretation of the biblical Job, who found himself outside society, gave points of recognition. And also Jeremiah 20, all day I have been made a laughing stock, which I experienced in the therapeutic community, also reflected in my novel. And surely the Psalms, 119, I'm a stranger here on earth. 130, out of the depth I cry to you. And St. Paul mentions the encouraging foolishness of this world and God's wisdom. And Henry Nouwen's interpretation of the returns of the prodigal son with the varying identifications of the main characters impressed me a lot. Now, this is how I came back to tradition, and my still turbulent moods can find peace in church on Sundays. In my novel, I've described many events in such a way that they can easily be understood by people who know the Bible as stages in a conversion story. Although there was also a friend who said to me, "Religion in your book?" Well, that didn't bother me at all. I grafted my final near psychosis in the novel into a kind of Noche Oscura, Jewel of the Cross, or Nuit de Feu, Blaise Pascal, like Jacob's struggle at the Jabbok with the angel. And then there is a happy ending, where the hero finds his princess, which in a sense corresponds to reality. I'm daily grateful that I have not to take psychopharmaceuticals for 35 years. And that for my attitude in the 1970s, I can only say what I put in Alectorius' mouth with Jeremiah 27, "You have outwitted me and prevailed." Thank you.
I will pick up my story of the day Cecil and a friend, instead of leaving me alone, took me to the hospital. At this juncture, I want to move on to the next notion, the notion of crisis of difference, next Girardian notion. Yeah. I will not be talking about the sacrificial crisis or about scapegoating, because no violence emerged between Cecil and me. This peaceful hospitalization is not the story of all psychoses. Situations may arise in which an all-against-one configuration emerges, with the psychotic person being the scapegoat. In my case, it didn't. Also, I was never put into solitary confinement. So to me, the most useful term for the crisis is the crisis of differences, which is basically about the differences in my head. Here I have to say something about the term individual that is often employed, also by René Girard himself, about the psychological branch of mimetic theory. Often it is opposed to individual psychology, which is then presented as being based on the autonomous subject. So if one wants to emphasize the importance of things happening in individual minds, one is often, among Girardians, reproached for reverting to or even regressing into individualistic ways of thinking. But what happens to the individual is also part of the anthropological story. To put it very simply, if violence is controlled by myths, rituals and prohibitions, then these anthropological phenomena have to be effective. That is, the myths must be believed in by individuals, the rights must be shared by individuals, and most importantly, the prohibitions must be observed by individuals. So an important part of the process of hominization is the internalization of culture, that is, obeying prohibitions also when the direct threat of violent retribution is absent. In monkey speak, this would be the wrath of the alpha male. I feel this individual, or maybe we should say intravidual part of the story, is also important and is consistent with mimetic theory as a whole. I take my glass for a moment. Mimetic theory focuses on the crisis of differences on a social scale. But the crisis of difference can also take place on an individual scale, or inside a single mind. Here comes a long quote from my book, in which I develop this problem or idea. In a psychosis, a number of important differences that are of fundamental importance in everyday life, are disrupted or have disappeared. One of the most important differences, according to mimetic psychology, is the difference between me and my models. It is a difference that is linked to a whole series of other differences. If I really believe that I am Einstein, then this also affects the awareness of my home country, my native language, whether I have children or not, my religion. Even the conventional difference between life and death, as we experience it in our Western society, cannot be maintained when such a radical appropriation of identity takes place. To remain Einstein, one needs a very occult explanatory system, for example, using reincarnation-like elements borrowed from other religions. I could cope with Albert as a first name because my first name happens to be Berry. But how do I explain Einstein's sudden command of the Dutch language? And what the hell is he doing in my birthplace? Much psychotic activity is concerned with solving such thorny riddles. Psychotic thinking is above all trying to make the world coherent, and for this coherence often very strange, outlandish ideas are required. Just as for Don Quixote, for remaining the knight he wants to be, a constant supply of wizardry is required. The only hypothesis that would return everything to normal, namely that I'm not Einstein, will, as long as I hold his identity in the clutches of my metaphysical desire, be the least plausible to me. Open a psychiatric textbook, or better yet, open Cervantes' Don Quixote, and you will read everywhere that no one will be able to talk a madman out of his delusions. End of the quote. So, the crisis of difference in terms of individual psychology then corresponds to the disruption of the internalized cultural system, that is, loss of self. This can lead to outrageous behavior and scandalous disinhibitions, but also to states very similar to the experiences reported by mystics. In any mystical teaching, it is always the self which is the great hindrance to experiential contact with the divine. When in mimetic theory, the term undifferentiation is used, emphasis is usually on its negative aspect. Focus then is on the loss of the difference between good violence and bad violence, leading to the escalation to extremes. Though rarely, Girard sometimes also employs the term positive undifferentiation. Here is one example taken from the Hölderlin chapter in Battling to the End. I quote from Girard, "Up to a certain point, we might be in a state of positive undifferentiation. In other words, identified with others. This is Christian love, and it exists in our world. It is even very active. It saves many people, works in hospitals, and also in psychiatric hospitals, we should add. And it even operates in some forms of research. Without this love, the world would have exploded long ago." Girard, he is speaking of loving sympathy for others. In mysticism, the dissolution of self and other may even be stronger, go farther than just empathy or sympathy. Loss of self is a very ambiguous term indeed. In terms of psychopathology, the words I prefer to use for distinguishing negative and positive undifferentiation are sacred and holy. The sacred then relates to being possessed, to metaphysical desire running out of control, to the chaotic and horrific parts of madness. The final chapter of my book is entitled "The Distance to the Sacred." Regaining distance to the sacred then would correspond to being taken out of a psychotic state. Being able to stabilize this distance then could be related to being dismissed from the hospital, to being cured, to seriously and definitively leave a psychotic period behind. One of the greatest tasks of someone who has suffered from psychosis, in my view, is how to integrate all the exotic experiences, all the special effects being exposed to in madtime in his or her life. There are some people who finally integrate their psychosis in terms of a spiritual awakening. It is not a term I would use for what I have gone through. I would rather say that I have been exposed to the sacred. Also, I never started on a mystical schooling. I thought that would be too dangerous for me. Still, certainly when growing older, moments of positive undifferentiation, moments of good loss of self occurred to me. For instance, when being enveloped in nature, or when experiencing a deep sense of beauty when listening to music. Inevitably, these moments bring me back to certain moments in my psychosis. When the fear of re-experiencing chaos has dissipated, when feeling assured that metaphysical desire will not carry me away once more, I can welcome those moments. They might be part of what Carl Gustav Jung called old age mysticism. No meditation or prayer is required. It just happens. So also my story has a happy ending. And like Michael, I'm also very happy to say that I have lived for decades, for decennia without using medicines. So yes, I survived and I am cured actually. I dare to say so. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael and Berry. I introduced this panel, and now I will extroduce it. Now that we heard the presentations of Michael Elias and Berry Vorstenbosch, I will now take the floor to conclude this panel. I will try to shed a narrative philosophical light to the theme of religion and madness, particularly psychosis, to show that psychosis is not so much something incomprehensible, irrational, or absurd, but that the possibility or the risk of psychosis belongs to human existence. That this possibility or risk is just part of being human. So, if there's anything characteristic in René Girard's vision of human existence, It is his conception of being human as relational. Girard coined the term interindividual together with the psychiatrist Jean-Michel Urgolian. We have heard this term many times already. As a variation on and in opposition to the predominant modern ideology of individualism in our culture. According to mimetic theory, being human is essentially relational, including all the positive implications, such as being able to learn, being able to cooperate, and the negative, such as rivalry and the scapegoat mechanism. Essential, that is, permeating all aspects of being human. For the theme of this panel, this raises the question of what can be said about madness and religion from the relational view on humans of mimetic theory. We can shed a phenomenological light on the question by mentally placing the basic condition of our relational view into brackets. That is to say, by switching off relationality, temporarily in mind. The French novelist Michel Tournier has done just that in his philosophical retelling of the story of Robinson Crusoe, a story originally from the 18th century. In his novel, entitled Friday, Tournier explores what it means to be all alone without relationship with others. He does that in a fictional way through the contrast character Robinson, a normal person whose condition, however, differs from ours, namely that he is alone, not for a few days or a few weeks, but for years. What does that do to a person? I'm asking this question, and I'll give Michel Tournier's answer to show that madness and psychosis are human phenomena, as I said. Just like, for example, addiction, psychosis is not an absurdity, but just a possibility within human existence. Not long after the shipwreck that landed him on the island, Tournier's Robinson begins to doubt his perceptions. It starts with him having to keep looking back to see if the island behind him is still there. But also what he sees in front of him, the things, the trees and the animals on the island, gradually becomes more shadowy and hallucinatory. Even the ground he stands on becomes unsteady because there are no others standing on the same ground. Thus, Robinson discovers by contrast, in the absence of others on the island, that it's normally the others who give our observations reliability and meaning. We know what we see because others can see the same thing. Can see. Others do not have to actually and always confirm all our perceptions, but it must be possible. On Robinson's Island, it's not, because there are no others. Robinson feels that his life is in decline and that he's going mad, and he desperately tries to reverse this decline. He maniacally starts to keep a diary so as not to lose at least his speech, and with that his humanity. He also imposes a strict order on his life. He does his daily things at fixed times. To this end, he builds a water clock and sets a calendar with a Sunday rest day on which he does not work. He writes a law book with rules to abide by. He even builds a prison in case he breaks one of his rules, and in which he indeed sets himself a few times. You wonder, why does he do that? Free as he is, because he doesn't have to take anyone into account. My explanation is that Robinson tries to create others on the island, so to speak. After all, in our ordinary lives, the rules and rituals by which we live come from others, usually past others from previous generations. These forms were not invented and set by ourselves. By installing these himself, however, Robinson is trying to set up something of a community on his own. But there are no others on the island. Over time, Robinson sees the senselessness and hopelessness of his venture, and then he stops doing anything at all. He goes to live among the pigs in a mud puddle. To arm himself against impending madness, Tournier's Robinson resorts to religion and the law. One could say that he is going to lead a religious life. On his day off, he has said on Sundays, he reads from the Bible, which he apparently managed to rescue from the shipwreck. He names his island Speranza, which means hope. Also, the daily rituals and the rules he imposes on himself acquire the force of law through the religious sanction he gives them. As a result, the laws acquire a transcendent character, transcendent in relation to the precariousness that's also inherent in his life. That's precisely why the law provides guidance. But because Robinson is alone and there are no others to support his footing, religion and the law do not function as real institutions for him. Yet, religion and the law give him something important, something that helps him to persevere, namely discipline. Discipline allows lonely Robinson to remain human. Inevitably, he will experience a relapse now and then, but thanks to discipline, he doesn't have to stay in it among the pigs in the mud puddle. What does this narrative exercise by Michel Tournier tell us about the theme of this panel? One could say Robinson's situation resembles the delusions and hallucinations of the psychoses that the experts in the panel have just talked about. In an earlier conversation with these two, in the Dominicus Church in Amsterdam, the phenomenon of psychosis was described as a state in which, first, you have lost your grip on reality, second, in which you hear things that are not there, that is, that are not there for others, or at least have a different meaning for others, so-called hallucinations. And third, in which you are convinced of ideas that are not correct, that is, that others think are not correct, delusions. This definition of psychosis hinges on the role of others in your perceptions and beliefs, which is in accordance with the insights of mimetic theory. The fictional story of Michel Tournier philosophically clarifies, by contrast, this substantial role of others in our perceptions and beliefs, in psychosis, but most of all, in general. We can also learn from this story that if there is no resonant interaction with others, or if others are simply absent, discipline may help us. René Girard's mimetic theory and its applications may provide this necessary discipline. Thank you so much for your attention.